heads were 800 or more miles, 1,300 plus kilometer, north in Kansas, Abilene, Kansas City, Dodge City, and Wichita. So once fattened, the ranchers and their cowboys drove the herds north along the Western, Chisholm, and Shawnee trails. The cattle were shipped to Chicago, St. Louis, and points east for slaughter and consumption in the fast-growing cities. The Chisholm Trail, laid out by cattleman Joseph McCoy along an old trail marked by Jesse Chisholm, was the major artery of cattle commerce, carrying over 1.5 million head of cattle between 1867 and 1871 over the 800 miles, 1,300 kilometers, from South Texas to Abilene, Kansas. The long drives were treacherous, especially crossing waters such as the Brazos and the Red River, and when they had to fend off natives and rustlers looking to make off with their cattle. A typical drive would take 3 to 4 months and contain tourmalines, 3 kilometers, of cattle 6 abreast. Despite the risks, a successful drive proved very profitable to everyone involved, as the price of one steer was $4 in Texas and $40 in the East. 302. By the 1870s and 1880s, cattle ranches expanded further north into new grazing grounds and replaced their bison herds in Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, Nebraska, and the Dakota Territory, using the rails to ship to both coasts. Many of the largest ranches were owned by Scottish and English financiers. The single large cattle ranch in the entire West was owned by American John W. Iliff, Cattle King of the Plains, operating in Colorado and Wyoming. 303. Gradually, Longhorns were replaced by the British breeds of Hereford and Angus, introduced by settlers from the Northwest. Though less hardy and more disease-prone, these breeds produced better-tasting beef and matured faster. 304. The funding for the cattle industry came largely from British sources, as the European investors engaged in a speculative extravaganza, a bubble. Graham concludes the mania was founded on genuine opportunity, as well as exaggeration, gullibility, inadequate communications, dishonesty, and incompetence. A severe winter engulfed the plains toward the end of 1886 and well into 1887, locking the prairie grass under ice and crusted snow which starving herds could not penetrate. The British lost most of the money, as did Eastern investors like Theodore Roosevelt, but their investments did create a large industry that continues to cycle through boom and bust periods. 305. On a much smaller scale, sheep grazing was locally popular. Sheep were easier to feed and needed less water. However, Americans did not eat mutton. As farmers moved in, open-range cattle ranching came to an end and was replaced by barbed wire spreads where water, breeding, feeding, and grazing could be controlled. This led to fence wars which erupted over disputes about water rights. 306. 307. Cowboys. A classic image of the American cowboy, as portrayed by C.M. Russell Charles Marion Russell Smoke of A.45, central to the myth and the reality of the West is the American cowboy. His real life was a hard one and revolved around 2 annual roundups, spring and fall, the subsequent drives to market and the time off in the cattle towns, spending his hard-earned money on food, clothing, gambling, and prostitution. During winter, many cowboys hired themselves out to ranches near the cattle towns where they repaired and maintained equipment and buildings. Working the cattle was not just a routine job but also a lifestyle. They cultivated in the freedom of the wide unsettled outdoors on horseback. 308. Long drives hired one cowboy for about 250 head of cattle. 309. Saloons were ubiquitous outside Mormondom. Butte on the trail. The cowboys were forbidden to drink alcohol. 310. Often, hired cowboys were trained and knowledgeable in their aids such as herding, ranching and protecting cattle. 311. 312. To protect their herd from wild animals, hostile natives and rustlers, cowboys carried with them their iconic weaponry such as the Bowie knife, lasso, bullwhip, pistols, rifles and shotguns. 214. 311. Many of the cowboys were veterans of the Civil War, a diverse group. They included blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, and immigrants from many lands. 313. The earliest cowboys in Texas learned their trade, adapted their clothing, and took their jargon from the Mexican vaqueros or buckaroos, the heirs of Spanish cattlemen from the middle south of Spain. Chaps, the heavy protective leather trousers worn by cowboys, got their name from the Spanish chaparreras, and the lariat or rope was derived from la rieta. All the distinct clothing of the cowboy: boots, saddles, hats, pants, chaps, slickers, bandanas, gloves, and collarless shirts were practical and adaptable, designed for protection and comfort. The cowboy had quickly developed the capability, even in the early years, to identify its wearer as someone associated with the West. It came to symbolize the frontier. 314. The most enduring fashion adapted from the cowboy, popular nearly worldwide today, are blue jeans, originally made by Levi Strauss for miners in 1850. 315. Before a drive, a cowboy's duties included riding out on the range and bringing together the scattered cattle. The best cattle would be selected, roped, and branded, and most male cattle were castrated. The cattle also needed to be dehorned and examined and treated for infections. On the long drives, the cowboys had to keep the cattle moving and in line. The cattle had to be watched day and night as they were prone to stampedes and straying. While camping every night, cowboys would often sing to their herd to keep the calm. 316. The workdays often lasted 14 hours, with just 6 hours of sleep. It was grueling, dusty work, with just a few minutes of relaxation before and at the end of a long day. On the trail, drinking, gambling, and brawling were often prohibited and fined, and sometimes cursing as well. It was monotonous and boring work, with food to match: bacon, beans, bread, coffee, dried fruit, and potatoes. On average, cowboys earned $30 to $40 per month. Because of the heavy physical and emotional toll, it was unusual for a cowboy to spend more than 7 years on the range. 317. As open range ranching and long drives gave way to fenced-in ranches in the 1880s. By the 1890s, the glory days of the cowboy came to an end, and the myths about the free-living cowboy began to emerge. 11. 318. 319. Cowtowns. Anchoring the booming cattle industry of the 1860s and 1870s were the cattle towns in Kansas and Missouri. Like the mining towns in California and Nevada, cattle towns such as Abilene, Dodge City, and Ellsworth experienced a short period of boom and bust lasting about 5 years. The cattle towns would spring up as land speculators would rush in ahead of a proposed rail line and build a town and these supporting services attractive to the cattlemen and the cowboys. If the railroads complied, the new grazing ground and supporting town would secure the cattle trade. However, unlike the mining towns, which in many cases became ghost towns and ceased to exist after the war played out, cattle towns often evolved from cattle to farming and continued after the grazing lands were exhausted. 320. Conservation and environmentalism. The concern with the protection of the environment became a new issue in the late 19th century, pitting different interests. On the one side were the lumber and coal companies who called for maximum exploitation of natural resources to maximize jobs, economic growth, and their own profit. 321. In the center were the conservationists, led by Theodore Roosevelt and his coalition of outdoorsmen, sportsmen, bird watchers, and scientists. They wanted to reduce waste, emphasized the value of natural beauty for tourism and ample wildlife for hunters, and argued that careful management would not only enhance these goals but also increase the long-term economic benefits to society by planned harvesting and environmental protections. Roosevelt worked his entire career to put the issue high on the national agenda. He was deeply committed to conserving natural resources. He worked closely with Gifford Pinchot and used the Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902 to promote federal construction of dams to irrigate small farms and placed 230 million acres, 360,000 m² or 930,000 square kilometers, under federal protection. Roosevelt set aside more federal land, national parks, and nature preserves than all of his predecessors combined. 322. Roosevelt explained his position in 1910: conservation means development as much as it does protection. I recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of 1908 editorial cartoon of President Theodore Roosevelt features his cowboy persona and his crusading for conservation. Our land, but I do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob, by wasteful use, the generations that come after us. 323. The third element, smallest at first but growing rapidly after 1870, were the environmentalists who honored nature for its own sake and rejected the goal of maximizing human benefits. Their leader was John Muir, 1838-1914, a widely read author and naturalist and pioneer advocate of preservation of wilderness for its own sake, and founder of the Sierra Club. Muir, based in California, in 1889 started organizing support to preserve the sequoias in the Yosemite Valley. Congress did pass the Yosemite National Park Bill, 1890. In 1897 President Grover Cleveland created 13 protected forests, but lumber interests had Congress cancel the move. Muir, taking the persona of an Old Testament prophet, 324, crusaded against the lumbermen, portraying it as a contest between landscape righteousness and the devil. 325, a master publicist, Muir's magazine articles, in Harper's Weekly, June 5, 1897, and the Atlantic Monthly turned the tide of public sentiment. 326, he mobilized public opinion to support Roosevelt's program of setting aside national monuments, national forest reserves, and national parks. However, Muir broke with Roosevelt and especially President William Howard Taft on the Hetch Hetchy Dam, which was built in the Yosemite National Park to supply water to San Francisco. Biographer Donald Worster says, saving the American soul from a total surrender to materialism was the cause for which he fought. 327, Buffalo. Wounded Buffalo, by Alfred Jacob Miller. The rise of the cattle industry and the cowboy is directly tied to epidemics of the huge herds of bison usually called the buffalo. Once numbering over 25 million on the Great Plains, the grass-eating herds were a vital resource animal for the Plains Indians, providing food, hides for clothing and shelter, and bones for implements. Loss of habitat, disease, and overhunting steadily reduced the herds through the 19th century to the point of near extinction. The last 10-15 million died out in a decade, 1872-1883, only 100 survived. 328. The tribes that depended on the buffalo had little choice but to accept the government offer of reservations where the government would feed and supply them. Conservationists founded the American Bison Society in 1905. It lobbied Congress to establish public bison herds. Several national parks in the US and Canada were recreated, in part to provide a sanctuary for bison and other large wildlife. 329. The bison population reached 500,000 by 2003. 330. End of the frontier. Following the 1890 US Census, the superintendent announced that there was no longer a clear line of advancing settlement, and hence no longer a contiguous frontier in the continental United States. When examining the later 1900 U.S. Census population distribution results though, the contiguous frontier line map from 1910 U.S. Census showing the remaining extent of the American frontier. Does remain. But by the 1910 U.S. Census, only pockets of frontier remain without a clear westward line, allowing travel across the continent without ever crossing a frontier line. Virgin farmland was increasingly hard to find after 1890. Haute railroads advertised some in eastern Montana. Baker shows that nearly 600,000 American farmers sought cheap land by moving to the prairie frontier of the Canadian West from 1897 to 1914. However, about two-thirds of them grew disillusioned and returned to the U.S. 11. 331. The Homestead Acts and proliferation of railroads are often credited as being important factors in shrinking the frontier, by efficiently bringing in settlers and required infrastructure. 332. Barbed wire is also reason to reduce their traditional open range. In addition, the eventual adoption of automobiles and their required network of adequate roads solidified the frontier's end. 333. The admission of Oklahoma as a state in 1907 upon the combination of the Oklahoma Territory and the last remaining Indian Territory, and the Arizona and New Mexico territories as states in 1912, marks the end of the frontier story for many scholars. Due to their low and uneven populations during this period, though frontier territory remained for the meantime. Of course, a few typical frontier episodes still happened, such as the last stagecoach robbery occurred in Nevada's remaining frontier in December 1916. The Mexican Revolution also led to significant conflict reaching across the US-Mexico border, which was still mostly within frontier territory, known as the Mexican Border War, 1910 to 1919. 334. Flashpoints included the Battle of Columbus, 1916, and the Punitive Expedition, 1916-17. The Bandit War, 1915 to 1919, involved attacks targeted against Texan settlers. 335. Also, a few minor fights involving natives happened as late as the Bluff War, 1914-1915, and the Posey War, 1923. 202. 204. Alaska was not admitted as a state until 1959. The ethos and storyline of the American frontier had passed. 336. People of the American frontier. Miners. In 1849, James W. Marshall was building a sawmill on the riverside of the American River when he noticed metal flakes under the tail race. He quickly recognized the flakes to be gold. However, the sawmill he was building was not his, meaning that when he finished building the sawmill, his client John Sutter would also notice. So word quickly spread of there potentially being gold in the American River. So everyone packed the essentials, hopped on their wagons, and headed down the Chilkoot Trail in order to strike it rich. This was the start of the California Gold Rush. 337. The California gold rush was both good and bad to America at the time. It simultaneously increased the population of California to almost 100,000 people, which helped with the modernization of California.